Welcome to the Living Well with Mental Illness podcast, where we explore the journey of living a fulfilling life with mental health challenges. Join us for real and vulnerable conversations about the difficult realities of living with a mental illness. We'll discuss how to find acceptance, build resilience, and discover what recovery and living well means to you. So I go to therapy, you go to therapy, we go to therapy together. We pretty much tell everyone in our lives that they should go to therapy. And so in today's episode of our podcast, we're going to be talking more about why we feel that's the case and why we feel that everyone can really benefit from going to therapy.
So even though we go to therapy independently and together, of the people in our lives, very little go to therapy. I think I can think of maybe one, maybe two,
right,
off the top of my head.
And why do you think that is?
Well, I think when we talk to people about therapy and we're like, yeah, you should go to therapy, it's often this case of like, yeah, I should. And when they talk about it, it seems like they're talking about it in relation to, a specific trauma in their life that happened recently that they're going to deal with. Not like I'm going to go to therapy regularly. It's like I'm going to go to therapy because I'm facing a crisis or I'm dealing with a crisis.
And I think that's the general understanding of what therapy is that you need to be facing an imminent crisis, a mental illness of some kind, or you need to have some tangible issue you need help with. But I think that that's really not the case with therapy. I think perhaps that's actually how both you and I got into therapy. So maybe we fall into this,
Right.
a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think engaging in therapy over time, not in periods of crisis and not dealing with specific issues, we've really come to understand the value of kind of ongoing doing that kind of work for yourself. So do we want to maybe start off by sharing how we both got into therapy? Do you want to go first?
Sure. So I guess I should say that like I've been in therapy before, but it's always been the like crisis sort of situation where
Right.
I'm going to go for 1 or 2 sessions and then just drop it kind of thing. But I started going to therapy regularly during the separation of my ex, now divorced ex-partner. And, that process in terms of like working through the divorce and separation, obviously that took a lot more than just a few sessions. And then it kind of went into like an ongoing thing in terms of, okay, well, I'm past the separation part, but like now I've got to deal with myself and also have to deal with like, the co-parenting dynamic and learning that and dealing with that. And then I met you and then, needed to keep going with therapy for that as well. So
I just want to say though, that like the way you started therapy this time is kind of beautiful in terms of having it be an opportunity to work through a really difficult period with someone else that, likely is not going to end with you together.
Yeah.
But still working on it together to make it as healthy as possible. And I think that's a really big, strength of therapy is helping you to figure out how to deal with life situations in the healthiest way possible and the most positive way possible for you and for the other people in your life.
Yeah. I mean, specific to the issue of divorce and separation, I mean, I know that we've seen people go through it and we recommend therapy. And I think there's this attitude that's just like, well, our relationship is falling apart. What's the point?
Right.
Right. And having kids, I think there was more of an understanding of like, okay, well, we still need to make this a good relationship, a working relationship, and model what that healthy relationship looks like to our kids, even though we're not together. So
Right.
I think there was incentive there to keep going.
And that can be a really hard thing to figure out how to do on your own. And so having the help of a professional therapist can really go a long way. So my background is, again, like kind of a crisis situation. I was having a really, really hard time with my mental health in university and very suicidal. I needed help, like acutely. And so I started counseling. I didn't really know how to be in counseling. And so it wasn't terribly effective. And so perhaps that's something we can talk about a little bit later, is how to get the most out of therapy. But I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know how to actively be a participant in my own therapy. So it went kind of ineffective for a long time until I, really decided, okay, no, I'm going to really commit myself to this. And that was when I was back here, not in university anymore. And
by commit yourself, do you kind of mean just open up and be vulnerable and tackle specific issues, or?
I think by commit myself, I mean that I understood that it was up to me how much I wanted to give of myself to the therapeutic process, and consequentially how much I would get back in return from the interaction and from the work being done.
Yeah.
You need to do a lot of work for therapy to be as effective as possible.
I think that's something to mention too, is that going to therapy itself isn't just, that's it, that's the work. It's a process of, thinking about what it is you are going to talk with your therapist about, or what it is that you need to deal with in your life. And then, talking with them, and then sometimes there's practical stuff that comes up in therapy that you need to deal with, or sometimes it's just you need to reflect on it and make changes in your life, or even just reflecting on it is enough sometimes.
And I think that is something that people assume about therapy, is that they can go see a therapist and that therapist is going to have answers for them, or they're going to be able to fix their problem or, guide them through life. But that's not really what therapy is. And I think that's a common misconception that holds a lot of people back, myself included. When I first started in therapy, I went to my therapist thinking, okay, he's going to fix me, he's going to have all the answers and I can just be here and he will fix me. But that's not the way it works. Like you said, it takes a lot of work on your part to really reflect on how your life is feeling for you and what areas you want to work on, and really using therapy as a tool for you to sort through your own life and have a bit of a grounded sounding board in terms of bouncing things off of. Or oftentimes, if you have a really good therapist, which I'm very glad to say we do, and so she does this, is, providing insights that maybe you're blind to. And so, but it's still you having to understand those insights that she's guiding you with, or that she's giving you, and figuring out, okay, how do I use this new information to be a more emotionally intelligent person, to be a more aware person of myself and of the other people around me and of my relationships and whatnot. And how can I use these tools that I'm learning in therapy to better engage with my life?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think a couple things that come to mind when you're talking about your therapist like that, like they're not there to fix you kind of thing. I think sometimes people go to therapy and they have that perception, and then they're disappointed because their therapist doesn't fix them. And then there's this like, well, I tried,
right,
and then quit. So understanding, first of all, that yes, like that's not your therapist's job to fix you. But then also, I guess there is still that kind of truth that not everybody's therapist is going to be a good fit for them. So, the ability to try out different therapists and see who you might find the most beneficial. But I do think that it's important to understand or remember that, your therapist isn't there to be your friend or your buddy and pat you on the back and, give you advice, telling you exactly what to do. Like, you do kind of have to accept that. I don't want to say that it's this uncomfortable relationship, because I don't think that it has to be like that, but that they should remain somebody who is neutral in your life.
Right. Yeah. So definitely important to find someone who feels good, who fits well, who you feel comfortable being vulnerable with, and who you find value in their insights they're providing you, or, value in the conversations or discourse you're having with them. But
you're paying them a lot of money.
You're paying them a lot of money. Yeah, that's another barrier, I guess, to why people don't access therapy is cost.
Yeah.
But yeah, like we have a friend who is in therapy, and she's picked a therapist who really does feel more like a friend and is really telling her things she wants to hear. And I totally understand how that is a really enticing trap in terms of picking a therapist. You know, it feels good to be validated and to be told, yes, you're right. And, oh, you're right. That's awful, blah, 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 whatever, you know, validating that way. But I think what's really lacking there and what's really important in terms of finding a good fit for a therapist is someone who is going to challenge you and someone who is going to push you to figure out how to be a better version of yourself. So do you want to share a bit about what you talk about now? You know, we mentioned that we both started therapy in the crisis situation and needing specific help with a specific issue. But, you know, what you do ongoing therapy now, so do I. Do you want to talk a bit about what kinds of things you talk to your therapist about now that are helpful on an ongoing basis?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the first thing to mention is that sometimes like crises do like bubble up and then it's good to just have a therapist who understands the like context of your life because they've kind of been following along and they kind of have a better perspective on how things are going. And instead of just when you go to a therapist and it's just a crisis and they're like, okay, I don't really know all the details and it's going to take me a while to like sort things out, that kind of thing. Whereas if you do have kind of a crisis problem and you go to your therapist, I feel like it's more effective if you've been seeing them on an ongoing basis. So that's the first thing. And then in terms of, well, what do you talk about when there isn't a crisis? Well, I think that first of all, probably everybody has stuff to unpack from their life that they haven't dealt with, that they kind of carry with them, and that it influences who they are.
It shows up in the way you engage with other people and with yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your attitudes about yourself and other people. And that in itself is probably like, okay, that's enough reason to go to a therapist and to just keep going to a therapist on an ongoing basis. And then I think a big part of going to therapy is having somebody who can kind of assist you in the personal development side of things. So you can talk to them about, okay, you know, I'm feeling like this is an area in my life that is lacking. And how do I address that? Where do I even start? You know, they can be a really good kind of sounding board on that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are the kind of core areas that I would say where I'm at with therapy. I think that there's probably a lot more that I could get out of it. But what do you talk about in therapy?
Yeah, when I tell people that I go to regular therapy, I think, of course, they're like, well, that makes sense. You have schizoaffective disorder. You know, you got issues, right? But what's interesting is that I do. It comes up because it's intermingled in everything. But I really rarely focus on my mental illness in therapy. It really is more just things that everyone deals with in terms of how I relate to myself, how I relate to other people, what I want out of life and how to work toward that and whatnot. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of the things that you mentioned are things that I also focus on in therapy. And something that comes up a lot, I guess, that's in relation to my mental illness is maladaptive coping strategies. But again, everyone has maladaptive coping strategies.
And I think that's kind of a bit of a segue in terms of, or maybe it's a segue, you can keep going, but in terms of why everybody should go to therapy.
Right. Yeah. I don't think I'm alone in coping with life and life stressors in maybe not the healthiest ways. And so therapy has been a really effective tool for me to reflect on how I'm coping, get a better idea of how I'm coping, decide for myself, is this how I want to cope with my life stressors? And then figure out with my therapist, okay, how can I maybe adjust how I'm coping and how can I cope in healthier ways and move towards just feeling better in terms of how I manage stressors in life. I just want to hop back and talk a bit more about something else that I find really valuable about how I engage in therapy. And it's around understanding my patterns in communicating with other people or relating with other people and how to more effectively communicate. I think that that is probably a really, really valuable tool that so many people need to work on. And therapy is a really beautiful place to work on that.
Yeah, I think kind of accepting the reality that unless you are a communications professional, maybe a psychologist or therapist yourself, I think that there's so many pitfalls in terms of communication with other people where there's room for miscommunication. And that's just a huge rabbit hole that kind of creates a lot of conflict with a lot of people.
I think it doesn't matter if you're a communications professional. Sure. I'm a social worker. It's literally what I do for a job. Mm-hmm. Our therapist has disclosed to us that she falls into pitfalls with her partner. If you're human, you slip up with communication and the way you relate to other people.
I think especially when you are in an emotional relationship with somebody and you're relating to somebody in an emotional way, then you're not always relating to them in a rational way. And that's where kind of communication can fall apart.
Right. Yeah. Humans are very emotional beings. And it is almost impossible to come to a situation with someone you have any kind of feelings with, which is literally everyone, and have a completely 100% logical, rational conversation that is devoid of emotional interference. Mm-hmm. And so learning how to understand and acknowledge your own patterns of what's activating for you, what you respond maybe not super positively with, or how you shift your communication style if you're feeling triggered by something, or just being more aware of how you engage in communication or how you engage with other people in more heated moments, or even not in heated moments. Maybe sometimes it's just good to just work on communication in general. And I think that therapy has been a really, really valuable tool for me in terms of increasing my own emotional intelligence in order to better show up in relationships in my life. And not only better show up, but more effectively engage the way I want to engage. Because I think so often, especially in interpersonal relationships, communication breaks down to a point where things are happening that you don't even want to happen. It's not how you want the communication to be happening. It just breaks down. And so understanding how to acknowledge that, be aware of it, take a step back and figure out how to rebuild is something that therapy can be really helpful with.
Okay, so one thing that you're wanting to return to is couples therapy in general.
Yeah, I think that perhaps we've fallen into this, mistake. And I know that other people who we know who have engaged in couples therapy have also fallen into this mistake where one person may be asking their partner to come to couples therapy in an effort to fix their partner, in an effort for their partner to see what they're doing wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that that is a huge mistake when you engage in couples therapy, because in order for it to be effective and to be helpful, both partners need to show up and be vulnerable, be open to the experience, and be really receptive to what's being communicated from their partner, be open to communicating honestly themselves, and be open to what's reflected back to you in therapy as well. And so, again, what I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, needing to show up and do the work yourself absolutely applies to couples therapy as well.
Definitely. And I guess just to add to that in terms of therapists, I think that's actually a more difficult job in terms of dealing with a couple. So again, maybe being open to understanding that your own personal therapist might not be a good fit for couples therapy, or might not do couples therapy. And it might take a few times to find the right therapist that works well for you as a couple.
Yeah, I think probably it's generally not recommended to have the same couples therapist as who you see, especially if it's just one of the people in the couple who sees the therapist individually. We are kind of in a unique situation where our couples therapist started as both of our individual therapists, and she agreed to see us more in a couples light. Mm-hmm. And work together. And that's just felt really good for us. And it's been really a good fit for us. But that's probably
Maybe we were just talking about each other too much, and she's just like,
you know what? This is
you guys need to talk.
This
to
is
each
ridiculous. We all need to get in the same room here and sort this out. Yeah. So that's kind of what works for us. But yeah, again, same thing, figuring out someone who fits well for you both and who challenges you both.
So the title of this podcast is Does Everyone Need Therapy? And I think we've covered quite a lot of reasons why everyone needs therapy, but maybe just a quick summary of some of the things that we've talked about and some of the things we didn't touch on as much, but are kind of obvious. So
like a list telling our audience right now why they need to get to therapy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we didn't talk about this, but it's obvious, I think, if you're dealing with like anxiety or depression or other mental health conditions, that's a reason to go to therapy.
I think just to like clarify here, not because you're broken because you have a mental illness, simply because having a mental illness is an additional stressor that can be really helpful to have a therapist help you figure out how to deal with and manage in your day-to-day life. And like I said, I have a mental illness, but it's not the center of what I engage in therapy with. It does show up because it's an added stressor, but it's not why I need intensive therapy, you know?
Mm-hmm. Okay, next thing on the list is coping with major life changes. So as I had already kind of brought up, like separation, divorce, that kind of thing. But obviously, there's a lot of other major life changes that happen that would be good to talk to a therapist about.
Mm-hmm.
Job loss, death of a loved one, that kind of thing. Major transitions in your life.
Major stressors, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of stressors, managing stress at work or with school, which I think are kind of really big stressors in people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
We talked quite a bit about going to therapy in terms of improving your communication skills and how that could help in your relationships. You talked about maladaptive coping strategies, but also learning how to cope with difficult emotions that you might be feeling.
Yeah, we meant to hit this emotional regulation and figuring out how to deal with that. I think that's something that's at the forefront of my mind because we have an almost 2-year-old right now who's struggling with learning emotional regulation. And it just strikes a chord in me of like, oh my God, yeah, I get that. Everyone has a hard time with emotional regulation, and therapy can be a beautiful tool for that. Anyway, sorry.
I think that there's this level of social conditioning or what becomes socially acceptable in terms of emotional regulation. And maybe you could call that a baseline, but it's not even a baseline because I don't think everybody totally adheres to that. Just like here's what's socially acceptable in terms of expressing your emotions. But I think a lot of people do have difficulty not expressing, but regulating emotions.
Well, the other side of that is, the learned societal, whatever norms that you were just talking about can sometimes be really unhealthy.
In terms of suppressing.
Yeah. And so learning how to healthily regulate your emotions is something that therapy can be helpful with.
We talked about self-improvement and self-growth, that being a useful area to talk to your therapist about. We talked about addressing past traumas or abuse. One to kind of finish off on that we didn't talk about, but is support, especially during specifically challenging situations like addictions recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, all those things are stressors in your life. And I think that all those things and more, whatever you're facing that is stressful or difficult in your life, therapy can be so, so helpful. And if you don't feel like you're facing anything imminently stressful as well, I can guarantee that there's some aspect of your life that you could benefit from speaking with a therapist about and just learning, even if it's just learning more about yourself and how you relate to the world, how you relate to yourself, it can be extremely beneficial.
Okay, I think we should kind of wrap up this podcast with me asking you a couple of questions, pretending, coming up with excuses for why somebody shouldn't go to therapy.
Oh,
okay. And you can come up with like, no, you still need to go to therapy.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
So, well, I could just talk to my friend about this.
Right. But your friend is part of your life and is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Biased. in terms of how they're going to answer you and how they're going to reflect your issues back to you. I'm trying to be delicate about this without like ripping you apart for this because, okay, it's not the same thing. A trained mental health professional will better be able to provide kind of a neutral stance or an unbiased stance and reflection back to you on how to navigate whatever issue you're facing. And so it's really, really not the same as talking with a friend.
Yeah. And I think that you could think about this also from the perspective of like, some of your friends might be good at listening. They might actually be good at providing helpful advice, neutral advice, but they might not. You know, they're not trained in that. Okay. So another question would be, well, therapy is too expensive, so I'm just not going to go.
Yeah. Therapy is really expensive, and I can absolutely empathize with that. I'm having a hard time with that currently right now as well. There are therapists who provide sliding scale options for if you maybe can't afford therapy. There are also a lot of companies that provide coverage that people don't actually know about. So through your benefits, through work, or through wherever you have health coverage, oftentimes at least a portion of psychology services is covered. And so explore that a little bit. Look into what your coverage looks like. And what we do actually is when we have coverage, it's only good for, I think, 10 sessions a year, which is not enough for me. I go more than that. And so I've come to an agreement with my therapist where she charges me a little bit less when my benefits run out, just to make it a little bit more manageable financially for me. And so be honest with your therapist about your financial circumstances, and they may be able to help you access funding through somewhere that you maybe aren't aware of, or they may be able to help you figure out your benefits or figure out something that works for the both of you. There are also mental health clinics oftentimes that offer free or sliding scale therapy.
I think something that's funny is that, there's people that we recommend therapy to that we know, like we'll ask, well, what are your benefits? And they're like, oh, it's covered 100% like 20 times a year. and we're like, what are you doing? Why aren't you taking advantage of that? So
if you have that kind of coverage, oh my gosh, don't waste it. It is such a valuable tool at your disposal. Use your benefits.
Okay, one more excuse. I don't want to talk to a stranger. They're just going to judge me.
I totally understand how it can feel that way. It's a very scary thing to go to a stranger and be extremely vulnerable with them. But I think it's important to understand the context of therapy, in that the therapist is there to provide completely non-judgmental reflection and, support for you. And really, they're not judging you. They're human. They may have whatever thoughts about what you're presenting with them, but they're really there. Their core purpose of why they've agreed to meet with you is to help you figure out whatever it is you need to figure out, and to really be there to support you in any way you need or ask of them within their capacity.
I think you could probably also flip that on its head a little bit in terms of the anonymity of perhaps your therapist not having any connection to your life. You should be able to kind of feel a little bit of security in terms of being more vulnerable, because nobody else in your life is going to know what it is that you talk to your therapist about. There's that, and I guess we didn't talk about that, but barring certain specific circumstances where your therapist is required to disclose by law, usually it's around self-harm or harm to elderly,
if
that
you're
kind
in
of
imminent
thing.
danger,
Yeah, that kind of thing.
To others.
Then you have that level of what's the word? Confidentiality. Right, exactly.
Yeah. And that can be another reason why it could be better to talk with a therapist than with a friend or someone in your life who, there would be inevitably a degree of judgment or a degree of feelings, because they are also involved in your life. And so having a little bit more of an arm's length with your therapist in terms of separation from your life, and being able to, provide you that reflection and a little bit more
unbiased,
objective view.
Yeah.
Or, yeah. So thank you everyone so much for listening to this episode of our podcast, Living Well with Mental Illness. I do want to just take a quick minute to remind you about our online peer support community. It's a really, really great community, not a replacement for therapy, but a really good complement to therapy to have that peer support element. We offer online peer support groups every week, and it's just a really, really great place to access support from peers, to relate with people who understand what you're going through. And so if that's something that you're interested in checking out, make sure to check out livingwellwithmentalillness.org to find out more and to join our peer support community. So thank you so much for watching or listening to this video. Again, you can find this podcast anywhere you get podcasts, but make sure to check out our YouTube page as well, where you can ask us questions in the comments and you can subscribe so as not to miss any future episodes.
If there is something that we've left out of this podcast in terms of why everyone should go to therapy, make sure to leave a comment in the YouTube video and share your thoughts about, why
or how therapy has been helpful for you if we missed it in this video.
That would be a great thing too. So other people can hear reasons why it's helping other people.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you in the next episode. Take care.
Bye.